Hi guys, imagine a mission where a single minute of miscalculation means missing the most wanted man in the Pacific and flying straight into a deadly trap. We're talking about Operation Vengeance, an absolutely insane aerial assassination from World War II that relied entirely on a compass, a stopwatch, and impossible math. A squadron of American fighter pilots had to fly hundreds of miles over open ocean, skimming just above the waves in absolute radio silence, to intercept a specific enemy plane at an exact second. If the wind shifted or their speed dropped by just 2%, the whole mission was doomed. This is the true story of the CLOCKWORK Ambush, a jaw-dropping thriller where American codebreakers and daring pilots teamed up to hunt down the mastermind behind the Japanese Empire's greatest strikes. Before we get started, if you enjoy exploring hidden corners of history at a slower pace, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. I'd love to connect with you there. It all started deep in a secret bunker in Hawaii, where naval intelligence officers affectionately known as the cryptographers of Station HYPO were sifting through mountains of intercepted enemy communications. They were working with the infamous Japanese naval code JN25, a complex cipher that was constantly changing and incredibly difficult to crack. But in early April 1943, they intercepted a message that changed the course of the Pacific War. Through a stroke of sheer luck and relentless dedication, these codebreakers deciphered a highly classified transmission containing the exact, minute-by-minute flight itinerary of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet. The message detailed exactly when he would arrive and depart from various bases in the Solomon Islands, flying in a G4M Betty bomber. To put this into perspective, this was like handing the US military the exact GPS coordinates of their biggest enemy. The cryptographers could hardly believe their eyes as they translated the specific times and locations, realizing they had a microscopic window of opportunity to strike. The intelligence was rushed directly to Admiral Chester Nimitz, who then had to get authorization from the President of the United States himself to greenlight what would become the most precisely calculated targeted operation in aviation history. So why was taking out Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto such a massive priority for the American forces? To understand the sheer gravity of this mission, you have to understand the man himself. Yamamoto was not just another high-ranking officer, he was the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and the most revered military figure in the entire Japanese Empire. His strategic brilliance and godlike status among his troops made him the absolute heart and soul of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Taking him off the board wouldn't just remove a brilliant tactician from the battlefield, it would be a devastating psychological blow crushing enemy morale. However, authorizing a targeted hit on an enemy commander of this stature was highly controversial and incredibly risky. If the mission failed, the Japanese would instantly realize their unbreakable JN25 code had been compromised, which would force them to change all their ciphers and blind American intelligence for the rest of the war. The stakes were literally all or nothing. American commanders debated fiercely because the intelligence indicated Yamamoto was known for his legendary punctuality. If his itinerary said he would arrive at 09:45, he would be there at exactly 09:45, not a minute early and not a minute late. This strict adherence to the schedule was the fatal flaw the Americans decided to exploit. But knowing where the Admiral would be was only 5% of the problem. The real nightmare was figuring out how to actually reach him. Yamamoto's route was deep inside heavily fortified enemy airspace, surrounded by rings of anti-aircraft guns and swarms of elite Japanese Zero fighters ready to tear any intruders out of the sky. The closest American base was on the island of Guadalcanal, sitting completely out of range for standard fighter planes. The military top brass quickly realized that standard tactics wouldn't work here. They needed a miracle of modern aviation, and pilots crazy enough to fly a one-way intercept route with zero margin for error. To pull off this impossible interception, the military turned to the only aircraft in the Pacific theater capable of surviving the journey, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. This twin-engine beast was heavily armed, incredibly fast, and most importantly, it had the massive range required. But even the mighty P-38 couldn't make the 1,000-mile round trip on its standard fuel capacity. Mechanics had to hastily fit the fighters with oversized external drop tanks, essentially turning these agile combat planes into flying heavy fuel stations. A select group of 18 highly skilled pilots from the 339th Fighter Squadron was chosen for the job, led by Major John Mitchell. When Mitchell was briefed on the mission, he thought the planners had lost their minds. The flight path was an absolute nightmare. To avoid detection by Japanese radar and vigilant coastal coastwatchers, the squadron couldn't just fly in a straight line. They had to execute a massive sweeping detour over the open ocean, staying at a maximum altitude of just 50 feet above the crashing waves. Flying this low for over 2 hours required superhuman concentration. A single momentary lapse in focus, a sneeze, or a slight dip of the nose meant crashing instantly into the Pacific. Furthermore, to maintain the element of total surprise, the entire flight had to be conducted in strict radio silence. The pilots couldn't speak to each other, they couldn't coordinate aloud, and they couldn't ask for navigational updates. They were flying completely blind and deaf to the outside world, relying on simple hand signals to communicate, while navigating a zigzag route designed to bypass every known enemy sensor. It was an unprecedented test of endurance and skill, pushing both the machines and the men inside them to their absolute physical limits. With no radar and absolutely zero radio communication allowed, the entire success of Operation Vengeance rested on the shoulders of raw, unforgiving mathematics. Major Mitchell had to navigate using a primitive but highly demanding technique called dead reckoning. This meant calculating their exact position based solely on their heading, their speed, and the time elapsed. Armed with nothing but a standard Navy compass and a basic stopwatch, Mitchell had to lead his squadron to a precise intercept point in the vast, featureless sky just off the coast of Bougainville. The mathematical calculations required were staggering. Planners had to factor in the cruising speed of Yamamoto's bomber, the speed of the P-38s, the exact distance of the circuitous dogleg route, and the unpredictable variable of ocean headwinds. If Mitchell miscalculated the wind drift by even a few degrees, or if their airspeed was off by just a fraction of a percent, they would miss the Japanese formation entirely. There was no room to circle around and look for the target. They only had enough fuel for a maximum of 10 to 15 minutes of combat before they had to turn back or risk ditching in the ocean with empty tanks. The timeline was so incredibly tight that they had to meet Yamamoto's plane at exactly 9:35 a.m. Not a minute earlier, not a minute later. Every second ticked away on Mitchell's stopwatch was a matter of life and death, representing physical miles travelled over the endless blue water. As the squadron roared silently over the waves, eyes glued to the instrument panels, the tension in the cockpits was suffocating. They were betting everything on the assumption that a Japanese admiral hundreds of miles away would be perfectly on time, and that their own grueling mathematical predictions were absolutely flawless. The greatest clockwork ambush in history was in motion, and the math was about to be put to the ultimate test. As the 18 P-38 Lightnings thundered mere feet above the whitecaps of the Solomon Sea, the physical toll on the pilots began to mount exponentially. Flying at zero altitude in the sweltering tropical heat was a completely grueling experience that tested every ounce of their stamina. The cockpits turned into absolute flying saunas, with temperatures soaring well over 100 degrees, baking the men inside their heavy flight suits. The Exhaustion was a silent enemy, just as deadly as any anti-aircraft gun. They had to constantly wrestle with the controls as the turbulent ocean air threatened to smash their aircraft into the unforgiving water below. Every pilot kept his eyes glued to the lead plane, maintaining a tight, staggered formation through sheer willpower and a series of frantic hand signals. They were flying through an invisible minefield, acutely aware that Japanese patrol boats or island-based coast watchers could spot them at any moment. If even a single enemy radio operator saw this massive strike force skimming the waves and sent out a warning, the entire element of surprise would vanish, and a swarm of Zeros would be waiting to tear them apart. Maintaining absolute radio silence was psychological torture. The natural instinct to call out a shifting wind or confirm a heading had to be violently suppressed. For over 2 hours of blistering, nerve-wracking flight, the only sounds were the deafening roar of their twin Allison engines and the relentless beating of their own hearts. As they prayed, the dead reckoning calculations were steering them toward victory and not a watery grave. The climax of their navigational marathon approached as the coastline of Bougainville finally materialized as a dark, hazy line on the distant horizon. Major John Mitchell glanced down at the standard-issue stopwatch strapped to his leg, watching the seconds mercilessly tick away. It was the moment of truth where all the impossible math had to translate into reality. At exactly 9:33 a.m., Mitchell signaled the squadron to begin their climb. They violently pulled back on the yokes, abandoning the deck and ascending rapidly toward their designated intercept altitude. This was the most vulnerable phase of the entire operation because breaking cover meant they would instantly light up any enemy radar in the sector. The pilots anxiously reached for the release levers to drop their massive external fuel tanks, shedding the dead weight to regain their plane's legendary speed and agility for the impending dogfight. But there was a terrifying glitch. Two of the pilots in the designated attack flight realized their drop tanks were jammed and refused to release, meaning they could not engage in the high-speed pursuit. Suddenly, the carefully laid plan was falling apart. The killer flight, originally composed of 4 aircraft assigned specifically to shoot down the bomber, was instantly reduced by half. It was a massive setback right at the finish line, leaving just Captain Thomas Lanfear and Lieutenant Rex Barber to execute the actual assassination against overwhelming odds. But there was absolutely no time to abort, no time to hesitate, and no radio channel to discuss a backup plan. They were locked into the trajectory of history, exactly as the minute hand swept toward 0934, breaking through the scattered cloud cover at 10,000 feet. A collective shockwave hit the American pilots. There, appearing like tiny metallic specks against the lush green backdrop of the island jungle, was the target. The mathematical miracle had actually worked. Against all logical odds, the P-38 squadron had flown over 400 miles of featureless ocean to arrive at the exact designated coordinate at the exact required minute, only to find the enemy formation flying right into their crosshairs. It was a moment of sheer disbelief, validating the genius of the Station HYPO codebreakers and the flawless dead reckoning of Major Mitchell. They identified the distinct silhouettes of 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, painted in dark green camouflage, lumbering through the sky. Surrounding them in a V formation was a heavy escort of 6 heavily armed Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, flown by some of the most elite and combat-hardened veterans of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Americans had expected only 1 bomber, but now there were 2. This unexpected variable meant they had absolutely no idea which aircraft was carrying Admiral Yamamoto and which one held his high-ranking staff officers. The margin for error had just evaporated entirely. They couldn't just shoot down one and hope for the best. Both bombers had to be completely destroyed to guarantee the success of Operation Vengeance. The trap was perfectly sprung, but the most dangerous part of the mission was just beginning as the P-38s pushed their throttles to the firewall and initiated a screaming dive toward the unsuspecting convoy. As the P-38 Lightnings descended like birds of prey out of the sun, the element of surprise gave them a crucial fleeting advantage. The Japanese Zero escorts cruising lazily above the bombers were completely caught off guard, never expecting an American strike force this deep inside their own heavily fortified territory. The sky instantly erupted into a chaotic, high-speed blender of tracer fire and roaring engines. Major Mitchell led the majority of the squadron upward to intercept the lethal Zeros, forming an aggressive defensive wall to keep the escort fighters desperately occupied. This critical maneuver cleared a microscopic window for Lanfear and Barber, the 2 remaining pilots of the killer flight, to plunge directly through the defensive screen and go straight for the jugular. The heavy bombers, realizing they were under a massive coordinated attack, immediately broke formation and dove frantically toward the dense jungle canopy below in a desperate bid to evade the incoming fire. They were flying so incredibly low that they were practically skimming the treetops, trying to use the jungle terrain to shake off their pursuers. Barber and Lanfear pushed their aircraft into a dangerously steep dive, G-forces crushing them into their seats. They chased the roaring Betty bombers right down to the deck, weaving dangerously through the jungle valleys at over 300 miles per hour. The heavy 50 caliber machine guns and 20mm cannons in the noses of the P-38s began to spit absolute fury, shredding the jungle canopy and chasing the frantic bombers as the ultimate high-speed assassination attempt reached its violent climax. As the desperate chase ripped through the humid tropical air, Lieutenant Rex Barber locked his sights on the lead bomber flying dangerously low over the trees. He squeezed the trigger, unleashing a concentrated, deafening stream of armor-piercing rounds that tore directly through the fuselage and the right engine of the Mitsubishi Betty. Thick black smoke and flames instantly erupted from the wing, leaving a violent, unmistakable trail across the sky. The Japanese pilot fought valiantly with the heavy controls to maintain altitude, but the catastrophic structural damage was just too severe to overcome. Barber flew so incredibly close to his dying prey that flying pieces of the disintegrating bomber actually struck the wings of his own P-38 Lightning. With a sickening lurch, the burning heavy aircraft clipped the towering jungle canopy and slammed violently into the dense Bougainville rainforest below. A massive pillar of fire and oily smoke shot up above the trees, marking the sudden, fiery end of the flight. The supreme commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the brilliant strategic mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor attack, was officially gone. There were absolutely no survivors in the mangled wreckage, but in the heat of the swirling, chaotic dogfight, there was zero time for the Americans to confirm the kill or celebrate the monumental victory. The sky above them was still a deadly maelstrom of angry Zero fighters desperately trying to avenge their fallen leader, and the second bomber was still desperately trying to make its escape toward the safety of the coastline. The remaining American pilots had to pivot instantly from the role of focused assassins back to desperate survival mode as tracers filled the sky. While Barber secured the fatal blow on the primary target, Captain Thomas Lanfear and the rest of the covering flight were locked in a desperate, twisting struggle against the furious Japanese fighter escort. The Elite Zero pilots, realizing they had spectacularly failed their singular, sacred duty to protect the Admiral, fought with a terrifying, almost suicidal ferocity to destroy the Americans. Meanwhile, the second heavy bomber, carrying Yamamoto's chief of staff and several other high-ranking naval officers, had dramatically altered its course, diving aggressively toward the surface of the water in a frantic attempt to outrun the unfolding carnage. But the Lightnings were absolutely relentless in their pursuit. Barber, having just pulled up from the jungle crash site to avoid the trees, spotted the second Betty hugging the ocean waves and banked sharply to intercept the fleeing aircraft. Joined by other P-38s diving from above, they raked the doomed bomber with a devastating, inescapable crossfire. The heavy aircraft shuddered violently under the relentless barrage of heavy-caliber rounds, quickly lost its lift and skipped violently across the water, before finally sinking beneath the rolling waves of the Pacific. Both enemy bombers were now completely destroyed. The core leadership of the Japanese combined fleet had been surgically eliminated in a matter of chaotic, blood-soaked minutes. But the staggering victory came with an immediate and terrifying realization for the American squadron. The impossible ambush was over, but the Hornet's nest had been violently kicked, and they were still hundreds of miles deep inside highly hostile territory, with fuel gauges practically hitting empty. The sudden, chilling realization of their extremely precarious fuel situation hit the American squadron like a physical punch to the gut. Major Mitchell, constantly scanning the skies and monitoring the chaotic, sprawling dogfight, knew they had pushed their luck to the absolute razor's edge of survival. He immediately broke the strict radio silence, his voice crackling urgently over the frequency with a desperate command to disengage and head for home. Staying even one more minute meant they would all drop into the ocean out of gas. The P-38s violently broke off their individual engagements, pushing their heavy throttles past the red line to escape the swarming cloud of enraged Zero fighters. One American pilot, Lieutenant Raymond Hine, was last seen streaming heavy smoke and fighting off multiple enemy interceptors. Tragically, he would never make it back, becoming the sole American casualty of this insanely daring raid. For the rest of the surviving squadron, the grueling flight back to the base at Guadalcanal was an agonizing, nerve-shredding ordeal that tested their sanity. The massive adrenaline rush of the attack was completely replaced by the terrifying slow-motion dread of watching their fuel needles dip dangerously into the red zone as they flew over the endless ocean. They had to aggressively lean out their fuel mixtures, essentially starving their massive engines just to squeeze out a few extra miles of flight distance. It was a completely different kind of mathematical nightmare now. Instead of calculating precise intercept angles, They were calculating whether they would actually make it to the runway or be forced to ditch their heavy planes in shark-infested waters. The radio was completely silent once again, but this time it was a heavy silence born of sheer anxiety as they limped across the vast expanse, nursing their battered machines home. When the dusty, uneven airstrip of Guadalcanal finally appeared in the hazy distance, it was a sight of pure, unadulterated salvation for the exhausted pilots. One by one, the battered P-38 Lightnings touched down heavily on the tarmac, their engines sputtering and coughing loudly as they practically ran on nothing but fumes. Some of the aircraft had literally only a few gallons of fuel left sloshing in their tanks, barely enough to successfully taxi off the active runway without shutting down. As the pilots finally climbed out of their sweltering, cramped cockpits, they were completely drenched in sweat and physically shaking from the unimaginable stress and fatigue of the marathon mission. They had actually pulled off the impossible. The entire base quickly erupted into wild, ecstatic celebration as the monumental news of the successful ambush spread among the commanders and ground crews. However, a massive, suffocating blanket of extreme secrecy was immediately thrown over the entire operation by high command. The military brass knew perfectly well that if they publicly took credit for the targeted assassination, the Japanese would instantly realize their supposedly unbreakable JN-25 communication code was entirely compromised. The greatest strategic victory of the air war had to be treated like it never happened. The returning pilots were strictly ordered to keep their mouths shut, and a brilliant, highly detailed cover story was quickly fabricated by intelligence officers claiming civilian coast watchers in the Solomon Islands had coincidentally spotted the Admiral's flight path. This crucial, life-saving deception ensured that the incredible codebreakers back at Station HYPO could continue listening to enemy secrets undetected, ultimately saving countless American lives as the brutal island-hopping campaign raged on. While the Americans silently celebrated their incredible aviation milestone, the situation on the Japanese side was a scene of absolute chaos and pure disbelief. A massive search and rescue operation was immediately launched into the unforgiving, densely packed Bougainville jungle. It took 2 grueling days of hacking through the thick, mosquito-infested underbrush before a naval search patrol finally stumbled upon the smouldering, mangled wreckage of the Betty bomber deep in the rainforest. The scene they found was a devastating psychological blow to the Empire. Admiral Yamamoto was found thrown clear of the main wreckage, still strapped into his heavy leather aircraft seat, with his white-gloved hand supposedly resting firmly on the hilt of his traditional samurai sword. He had perished before the damaged aircraft even hit the jungle floor, the victim of the intense heavy-caliber crossfire. The Japanese government and military high command were absolutely paralyzed by the loss of their greatest strategic icon. They kept the catastrophic news completely hidden from their own public for over a month, terrified of the massive emotional impact it would have on a nation that viewed the Admiral as an invincible, almost mythical figure. When the official announcement was finally broadcasted over the national radio networks in late May, it sent a massive, undeniable shockwave of grief and demoralization across the entire country. The brilliant architect of their naval dominance was officially gone, and the unstoppable, sweeping momentum they had enjoyed at the very start of the Pacific conflict was rapidly evaporating. The loss of his unparalleled strategic mind and deep connection with the fleet created a massive, unfillable void in the Japanese high command. They had lost the one commander who truly understood the industrial might of the adversary they had awakened, and his absence marked a definitive, irreversible turning point in the momentum of the Pacific theater. Back in the United States, even years after the conflict ended and the strict operational secrecy was finally lifted, the mission sparked one of the most intense and longest-running controversies in military aviation history. The massive, enduring question remained: who exactly delivered the decisive strike that brought down the Admiral's aircraft? For decades, a bitter historical dispute raged between Captain Lanphier and Lieutenant Barber. Initially, the military awarded full, undisputed credit to Lanphier, who heavily publicized his own account of intercepting the primary bomber. However, high-speed aerial combat is incredibly chaotic, and human memory is a notoriously unreliable witness when flying at over 300 miles per hour while aggressively dodging enemy counterattacks. Later investigations, deep analytical dives into classified Japanese military records, and extensive interviews with the surviving Zero escort pilots began to paint a completely different picture of the timeline. The general historical consensus slowly shifted to support Rex Barber's detailed account of the engagement, indicating that his relentless pursuit and precise tracking were what actually doomed the lead aircraft. The debate got so heated it eventually reached official military boards. Ultimately, the Air Force officially split the credit equally between both pilots, acknowledging that the extreme fog of war makes it mathematically impossible to definitively separate the interwoven, split-second actions of two brave men flying in a screaming dive over the jungle canopy. Regardless of exactly whose round struck the engines first, the sheer mechanical execution of the Clockwork Ambush remains a monumental, almost unbelievable testament to human ingenuity and raw, unfiltered navigational skill. Today, modern military aviators rely heavily on highly advanced satellite networks, automated targeting computers, and real-time digital data links to intercept moving targets with pinpoint accuracy. These men did it with a simple piece of paper, a wooden pencil, and a wind-up pocket watch. They successfully executed an unprecedented 400-mile strategic flank over featureless shifting ocean water, intercepting a fast-moving target at an exact, predetermined minute in time, and they achieved all of this while flying a massive heavy fighter plane just 50 feet above the crashing waves to completely evade coastal radar detection. It is a mathematical and piloting achievement that still absolutely baffles modern aviation experts and aerospace engineers when they attempt to digitally recreate the incredibly strict parameters of the historical flight. Furthermore, the successful interception proved the incredible, world-changing value of advanced signals intelligence on a global scale. The brilliant exhausted cryptographers working in the basement of Station HYPO who cracked the complex JN25 code didn't have to fire a single weapon, but their relentless analytical work allowed the military to surgically strike the very strategic heart of the adversary's operations. It was the perfect, unprecedented marriage of mind-bending cryptography and fearless tactical piloting. This specific mission essentially proved to the highest levels of command that gathering invisible intelligence was just as critical to victory as manufacturing heavy firepower. It completely revolutionized how the United States military approached targeted long-range operations and fundamentally shaped the foundational tactics for modern covert intelligence operations that are still highly utilized in the field today. The incredible true story of Operation Vengeance serves as a stark, dramatic reminder of how the tiniest, seemingly insignificant variables can ultimately dictate the massive fate of nations. If the unpredictable Pacific headwinds had been just slightly stronger that morning, if the naval codebreakers had mistranslated a single crucial syllable in the intercepted radio transmission, or if the famously punctual admiral had been delayed for his flight for the very first time in his extensive career, the entire trajectory of the Pacific campaign might have looked drastically different. It was a literal one-in-a-million shot executed with absolute flawless precision. The 18 dedicated men of the 339th Fighter Squadron flew completely blind into the absolute unknown, trusting their very survival to handwritten mathematical calculations and their own unwavering ironclad courage. They effectively transformed heavily armoured P-38 Lightnings into stealth weapons of pure precision geometry, pulling off what is widely considered the most impeccably timed aerial ambush in recorded human history. The Clockwork mission stands forever as a legendary, awe-inspiring chapter in aviation history, where time, speed, and distance were perfectly harmonized to outsmart an empire's ultimate mastermind. So the next time you casually check the GPS mapping app on your smartphone to find the absolute quickest route to the grocery store, take a brief second to remember the incredible pilots who navigated halfway across the vast Pacific Ocean, perfectly intercepting a tiny moving dot in the infinite sky using absolutely nothing but a magnetic compass, a mechanical stopwatch, and some truly impossible math. Thanks for watching, guys, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more incredible historical deep dives.